All right, we're going to get started. Welcome to the very first live stream of RahatCodes. If you're watching this later, which you probably are, this is going to be uploaded to my YouTube channel, which I will link out on Twitter. Um, we'll probably eventually have this moved over to a personal website that I'm building, but for now, it'll be available here and on YouTube. Right. So, with this being the very first time we're streaming, I'm just going to go over why we're doing this stream and what we're going to be building. So, the reason I'm doing this stream is to go over some basics that I've already learned of like React, um, Mongo, Express, things like that, things that I've learned from my bootcamp, to just go over those skills again, make sure that they stay fresh in my head as I go through my everyday life currently as a software engineer. And I also wanted to kind of give back like a little bit of a tutorial, a little bit of introduction to these technologies. I'm not going to cover too much of like React and Express stuff in detail, but I'll probably go into the GraphQL side of things in detail. I actually, for my capstone project at my bootcamp, my group and I, we actually learned GraphQL in a couple weeks and decided to make a GraphQL API for our final projects. So this kind of has some of the stuff we learned from there and some of the stuff I've learned since then. Cool. So what are we building? Let me switch over so you can see my screen. All right. So what we're building is really simple. I wanted to start the stream off with something very simple, fun to build. So this is going to be a superhero rock paper scissors game. So the stack, like I mentioned before, it's stuff I learned from my bootcamp. It's a MERN stack, so that's MongoDB, Express, React, and Node. And I'm going to be throwing GraphQL in the mix in there. So the description, this is going to be a really simple app. What you're going to be able to do is choose a superhero. With that superhero, you play a rock, paper, scissors style game. And what we want is for all wins to be recorded for the chosen superhero. And the metrics we're going to track are number of wins per hero and number of times each hero is chosen. At the end, we'll display a top 5 chart for hero popularity and wins, and see if like there's any correlation between popularity and wins, which there probably is. So the backend API, the data that we're tracking is just the name of the hero, the number of wins that the hero has, and the number of times that the hero is used. Like I said, we're keeping it really simple just to get an idea of how to use these technologies. So what we're going to have to do in the back end, aside from creating our Express server, things like that, and all of our data models, we're going to need to, the main things, I broke it into three main things: an initial GraphQL mutation, which is going to add superheroes to our API, a query to display all of the available heroes, and then mutations to handle recording wins and the number of times that each hero is used. So whatever these, if you're not familiar with GraphQL, these might not make too much sense to you right now, but as we go through, I'll explain each thing more in detail. Before we even get into these, though, we just have to do like an initial setup and go from there. So these streams are probably going to be about 30-35 minutes every week, Monday at this time. And they will, of course, be uploaded later for viewing. So I'm not going to go probably too far into things today. Today, we're probably just going to do an initial setup of our backend and just get that set up on GitHub. I'm thinking probably next week we'll have a simple first version of our backend set up, and we'll go ahead and deploy that straight away to um, this service that I really like. It's called now.sh, and they make it really simple just to host both backend APIs as well as full stack and front end projects too. So I'm keeping the backend and the front end separate. There's going to be separate repos for each of them. I just like having them separated. It feels much cleaner to me, much nicer user experience, in my opinion. I could be wrong. I know some people like mono repos, things like that, but for our purposes, we're going to have two separate repos for backend and front end. The front end is going to be just a simple create React app. We're going to try to use hooks. I'm still learning hooks, but I figured, the best way to learn it is to see if I can teach it. So you'll see me struggling through probably trying to figure out the right type of way to write some hooks, but we'll get through that together. Other than that, we're not really going to be using anything super fancy. That we're going to use Apollo client on the front end to interact with our GraphQL API. And again, we're just going to keep it really simple. Depending on how the stream goes, on how this project goes, I do have ideas for other projects that are a bit more complex. And I'll talk more about those as we progress through a couple more episodes, couple more streams, and we'll go from there. All right. So we're going to start just straight off. So I'm in like this projects folder that I have. If you're following along, you want to create your own thing, you can just go into your terminal, cd into wherever you want to save your stuff. We're going to be putting this up on GitHub straight away too in just a sec. So I'm just going to make a new folder. Make dir, let's see, superhero. I cannot spell superhero. All right, superhero RPS API. Great. Let's cd into that folder, and we're just going to do a git init. Oh, not a git init. Well, that's fine. We have to do that eventually anyway. npm init. All right. Just gonna go through, press enter on all these things. This is just gonna make us a little package.json in our folder. I'm gonna open this up in VS Code. So I'm using VS Code to code. This is just my editor of choice. You can use anything you like. Doesn't really matter. If you like Atom, if you like Sublime, all of that is perfectly fine. I'm not really going to be doing anything VS Code specific, so it doesn't matter. Anything you can do in VS Code, you can do in the other editors too. So it's really your choice what you want to use. So yeah, we got this little package.json that's based on all the little questions that I just said yes to everything on. Cool. So we're gonna install a couple things in here. All right. First off, there's a couple dev dependencies that I want to install. So npm I think it's -d. Pretty sure it is. Let me just look this up real quick. So I'm gonna be looking stuff up as we go through. I don't have everything memorized. I don't think anyone will ever have anything memorized. Part of the job when you're doing software engineering is to Google like everything. I Google everything at my job like every single day. I built a lot of React components, but I still have to look up map every once in a while just to make sure I'm doing it correctly. So npm dev dependencies. Just to make sure I'm doing this right. So according to the npm docs, I can just do npm install package name --save--dev. Okay. So I just do npm I because I'm really lazy. I don't want to type in install. So that's fine. So we're going to put in Babel CLI, Babel core. And these are just a few things I'm doing. I want to be able to use imports in Node. I just feel like I like writing it that way. So I'm just doing a little bit of setup so I can do that. So Babel CLI, Babel core, Babel node, Babel preset, env. Also nodemon. I know some people say nodemon. I like nodemon because it kind of sounds like a Pokemon, and I love Pokemon. And then we'll just add --save -dev flag. So we're gonna let those install. Oh, what happened? It's not. Hmm. Might have typed it in wrong. All right, let's not worry about NodeMon yet. Cool. So while those are installing, I'm also going to bring up, since we're using MongoDB, so I've signed into the MongoDB Atlas over here. And what I'm going to do is just really quickly build a cluster. This is going to take some time. So just want to do everything kind of asynchronously so we can get everything up and running. I'm just going to use the free create a cluster, not paying anything. And if you're just playing around, I don't recommend paying for it either. Just use their free tier. It's more than enough for when you're just putting together a prototype or something. So I'm just like clicking. I usually just use the AWS provider. I've never used either of these two. Again, it's up to you, whatever you want to use. Um, North Virginia is the closest thing to me. So I'm going to create the cluster. And it's going to take some time. It says 7 to 10 minutes. I think it takes more like 2 to 5. But cool. So we've got our Babel stuff in our dev dependencies. Perfect. And let me also do npm I nodemon dash dash save dash dev. So nodemon is just basically, if you're not familiar with it, when you use Node to open up like one of your server files or something, you have to like restart Node every single time you make a change. Nodemon is just going to listen for all your changes and then restart your server for you. Again, it's really in your best interest to be as lazy as possible when you're coding. You want to focus on the actual code and not all these other factors. So these are just stuff to make your life a little easier. All right. So all the Babel stuff is in there. So in our root file, we're just going to create a new file and we're going to name it .babelrc. This just needs to be in there. It's a sort of a boilerplate Babel thing, just so we can write fancy JavaScript on the back end. Ooh, I think prettier is just like automatically formatting this for me. I don't like that. Save. That's much nicer. Okay, and then we got to go in our package.json. I always forget to do this and I wonder why it doesn't work, but I remembered this time, so that's amazing. And I'm just going to have this copied from elsewhere, but so there's this test thing. We don't have a testing tool set up yet. We can worry about that later if we do it. For now, I'm just going to define a start script. And our start script is basically going to say run no daemon dash dash exec. It's just a flag for Babel, and we're going to run Babel node. It's going to go into our source / index.js file, which does not exist yet, but it will exist in a little bit. Cool. So let's make that. So now I want to make a new folder. We'll call it source, just like we said over here, and a file that's just index.js. Just make sure this works. I'm gonna console.log hello Twitch. Okay, great. Provided that works, and I might have missed something, and we'll see if I missed anything. All you have to do is run npm run start or npm start, and we should get a hello Twitch in here. So npm start. Yeah, cool. So we're good so far. So far. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of things that I mess up on as we go along, and that's totally fine. Cool. So next step, I'm going to install a few more things that we're going to need to work on our backend API. I'm just going to close this over here. So npm I, and we're going to get Apollo server. So Apollo server is just going to help us basically with writing our backend GraphQL. Apollo's great. Definitely look into their documentation. They have really great stuff just for getting up and running really quickly with GraphQL. So since we're using Express, we also want to install Apollo server Express. We're also going to do .env, which I'll explain more about in a little bit. We actually want to install Express, of course. GraphQL, Mongoose, GraphQL, Mongoose. Pretty sure that's there. I just can't see it. Oh, there it is. Mongoose. Mongoose is basically the ORM that we're using to interact with our MongoDB database. If you've had any experience with MongoDB before, it's probably something you've seen. Cool, and I think that should be all we need. So let's install that. These are not going to be dev dependencies, just regular dependencies. Dev dependencies are basically stuff that you probably only really need when you're developing. When we actually put this up on now, a lot of this stuff is just not going to be necessary. Cool. So we should have everything that we need installed. If there is anything more, we can install that later. But for now, we should be all set. Right. So in the index.js, let's do a couple things. Let's import Apollo server from Apollo server express. We're going to import express from express. Import mongoose from mongoose. We're going to require require .env and .config. Just gonna call that right away. If you want to use .env, basically it's for environment variables, and we're gonna need a couple environment variables for connecting to our MongoDB database. What I'm gonna basically be doing here is making sure that we don't upload my Mongo keys to the world. So all of that will be saved in a variable environment variable file. So there's that. And there's a couple more things, but we're going to skip those for now. And let's go ahead and get this started. So const app equals express. Just getting express started over here. We're not going to worry about Mongoose just yet. Let's see. Actually, let's go ahead and get this all set up. So mongoose.connect. I'm going to say process.env.mongo URI. And I'm going to basically define these environment variables inside of my .env file, which does not exist yet. It will exist very soon. And we're also going to pass this object. Use new URL parser, true. There's a couple more things. We can worry about those later. There's just a couple like warnings that we might get from Mongoose. So this avoids one of them. Now, const server equals new Apollo server. So actually, before I continue with this, I'm going to do a couple more things here. Actually, no. This is fine. So const server, and there's a couple things it's going to take. Are type defs. Type defs are basically the schema of your GraphQL API. All of the types that you're defining, and I'm going to define some really simple types in a second right now. But your queries, your mutations, everything that you're defining kind of goes in here. And then resolvers. So what does a resolver do? So even if you have like a GraphQL API kind of stitched up, you have a bunch of things defined. GraphQL itself is not going to know like, okay, what do I do with this query? What do I do with this mutation? The resolvers are like kind of like what happens under the hood to actually make an interaction with a database or add something to your database or something like that. So type defs, we're going to be focusing on two types of things. It's going to be queries, mutations, and well, I guess three types of things, and also some like types that we define ourselves. But queries, just as the name suggests, basically lets you read whatever is in your database. Mutations basically let you interact with your database. You can make a full CRUD API just by using queries and mutations. It's one of the things I like about GraphQL APIs. Makes it a little bit simpler, in my opinion, to create a full CRUD API, like we just said. Cool. And we're just going to also pass a couple other things. Cannot say this word. Introspection. Yeah. This is just some boilerplate stuff just to make sure that we're able to use what's called a playground. If you've ever used something like Postman, you'll understand what playground is. It's just a way for you to kind of test and interact with your GraphQL API. So this stuff basically lets us use it also in production, which you don't really want to do, but for the purposes of the stream, we'll allow it to happen. Cool. Now we're just going to do server.apply middleware, and we're just going to structure out app, and we'll say app.listen, say port 4000, callback function, and we're just going to console.log I don't know, a rocket. The server is blasting off. Hooray. Okay. And what this should do is basically, if I did this correctly, we should have a server running on 4000. I didn't actually do this correctly because we don't know what type defs and resolvers are. So I'm just going to really quick define those in here. We're going to move them out in a second. But const type defs, it's going to be an object. So let's see. We can do something like, we'll define a query. So one thing I forgot to bring in, we also need to bring in something called GQL. So over here, we brought in our Apollo server from Apollo Server Express. We're also going to bring in GQL. GQL basically lets us pass a string to our type defs, and this string is basically parsed into a GraphQL query. So GQL, what did I do? So you can also use the terminal here. I don't like it. I like having it separate. Let's Control Z out of this, or Command Z. I used to be a Windows user, so sometimes still say Control. All right, cool. So const type defs, it's going to be, okay, I didn't do this correctly. GQL, and we're going to use backticks. This is basically how you define your GraphQL queries. So we're going to define a very simple query, something I'm sure every one of you have done at some point in your life. We're going to define a hello world function. So we're going to call it hello. So this query is just called hello. Whenever we query for hello, we want to get back a string, and we're going to say that's required. We must get back a string every time we query for hello. Cool. So that's our first type def, our first query. So like I mentioned before, we need to make sure that we have a resolver so that GraphQL knows like what exactly like to do in this case when it gets the hello. So we're going to have const resolvers, and a resolvers is going to be an object. So we have up here a type query. So we got to make sure the first thing we have here is a query object. And the first query we have is hello string. So we need to make sure that we have a hello property here. And what we want it to do is just going to be a function that returns the string hello world. That's it. So this is basically what we're telling GraphQL to do. Okay, anytime you get this query hello, what you're going to do is just return me a string that says hello world. Pretty simple. This is just to get us started and to play around with the playground a little bit. So if I did this correctly, I think I did. We'll find out in a second. We'll do npm start. Oh no, I did not do something correct. Oh, so let's not worry about this for a second. We're not using Mongo just yet. Save that. Great. Cool. So as the server's blasting off, so that means if we head over to localhost 4000, we should be all right. So let's do that over here. Localhost 4000. Ooh, cannot get. It's going. Oh, let's go localhost 4000 / GraphQL. There we go. I think this is just some cache from a previous project that I was doing. Great. So this is your GraphQL playground. Similar to Postman, you can interact with your GraphQL API, test out if your queries and your mutations are working. If you look on the right side over here, you have a schema. Your schema is going to tell you everything you can basically do with your GraphQL API. So remember, we defined this hello query. It's in here. Great. So we're going to write out a query, and we're going to say hello. And if I hit this play button, it should say hello world over here. Boom. It worked. I did this in almost my first try. I had to take out the mongoose thing because we haven't set that up yet, but not bad. All right. So that is how you write a very, very, very simple GraphQL query. We spent a little bit too much time today kind of going over what we're doing, and I spent a little time talking in the beginning of this. So I think this is a good place to stop for now. We've set up our backend, sort of. We've set up our the ability to use GraphQL. In next week's session, what we're going to do is move these type defs and these resolvers out into their own files. And we're also going to set up a connection with mongoose.connect, and we'll see if we can go ahead and make our first actual mutation and try to save a superhero into our MongoDB API. So thank you very much if you were on here and you know watching this very first episode of RahatCodes. Like I said, I will tweet out a link later for you to go over this and watch this on YouTube. If you enjoyed this, I'm going to put this up on GitHub and share the link in a little bit. Um, if you enjoyed this or you have any suggestions, you have anything, any type of feedback you want to give, I'd really appreciate if you raise a issue in the GitHub page that I'll be sharing out on Twitter, on LinkedIn, as well as in the next episode. And I'd really love any constructive criticism, any feedback that you all can give on anything that I've done so far. Right now, we haven't done too much, but I'm sure there'll be some more stuff as we go along. I really appreciate any kind of constructive criticism. And if you raise a really cool issue and you're up for it, maybe we can pair program on a future stream, right? So thank you very much for taking part in the very first RahatCodes stream, and we'll be back next week. Bye bye.